All right, so I'm Dr. De Leon. My name's up there on the board. I'm a physical medicine rehabilitation specialist. I was a combat medic starting my career, eventually became an emergency medical technician in New York City, eventually became a doctor, and then became an EMT course director for several years when I was at Fort Campbell. So I've been teaching medics, medical students, residents, nurse practitioners, different things. And I'm going to create a series of lecture series, all short videos, 20-30 minutes at most. The first one today that we're doing is going to be pulse. So we're doing our vital signs on patients. We're taking pulses. How do we interpret? What does a pulse mean? What are we trying to learn from that information? All right. Well, a pulse is a measure of what the heart is doing. All right. So we're trying to get an idea of how functional is the heart. Is it doing its job? All right. But what kind of organ is the heart? If the body was a machine, which it is, and you were to replace a part and you were going to the hardware store, you're saying, well, I got this thing, and you're trying to describe what it is, you would end up with the word pump. It's a pump that circulates, and any circulatory system has a pump, a container, and a fluid. The fluid being blood, the container being the blood vessels, and the pump itself, the heart. Well, any pump, you want to get an idea about what its function is, what its needs are. All right? So if we're talking about any pump, and let's say we're talking about your pool, you want a pump to circulate water through the filter to clean the pool water. All right, and your pump goes bad and you go to buy a new one, and the guy at the store says, well, I got two that fit your system. One is about this big, the other one is this big, both fit in the pool mechanical room you got, both cost the exact same amount of money, both have a lifetime unlimited warranty, zero deductible, and we will be there same day within an hour guaranteed. All right, we have somebody on call 24/7, will always be there for you. If you have any problems and they cost the exact same, which one would you buy? Well, you got to ask about the pumps. But what do you want to know about the pump? Ultimately, you want to know how well does it work? Well, how do you define how well it works? Well, if you want to define how well it works, you're going to talk about its output. And output is defined by what? How do you define an output? Well, the little pump is going to pump 100 gallons an hour through your filter. The big pump is going to do 10 gallons an hour. Which pump do you want to buy? Well, the little pump, it's going to pump out 100 gallons an hour. Well, let's go to the terms. Gallons, that's a volume. Excuse me. So an output is a volume per unit time. It's not 100 gallons 20 a day, it's 100 gallons an hour. So there's a volume per unit time. That's an output. In the case of the heart, we call it the cardiac output. So you're trying to get a sense of what's the cardiac output. Is it doing its job? Is it putting out enough volume per unit time? Well, then we have to figure out, well, okay, how do I know that right now my heart is putting out the proper amount of volume per unit time? Just from across the room, you're looking at somebody and you're going, well, I don't know what his cardiac output, I don't know what his pulse is, I don't know anything about him. But as far as I'm concerned, I don't care. What do you mean you don't care? What would be the thing that would tell you their cardiac output is fine? Their mental status, their brain. Because how long does it take the brain to figure out the cardiac output is not achieving mission? Well, let's test it. If I were to squat down, and we've all done this, we're working on something, we squat down, all right, and we get up suddenly, and all the blood pools in our legs, so we don't have blood return to our heart, and for one heartbeat, our heart is squeezing an empty chamber. How long does it take us our brain to realize there's a problem. Instantaneous. Instantaneously, the brain notices, whoa, 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 I'm not getting what I need, and it's going to tell you. So if the person has an altered mental status, we got to start thinking the cardiac output is an issue. If the person has a normal mental status, the cardiac output is achieving mission. That's the fastest test. We know right away, if our patient has a normal mental status, the cardiac output is adequate. Now, if it's going to stay that way or whatever, then we look at, well, how hard is it working to achieve mission? So any pump has two dials. So if you're going to adjust it, I don't want to put out 100 gallons a minute. I want to put out only 50. I don't need to pump that much. That's the max setting is 100, but I only need 50. The other pump can only do 10 gallons a minute, 10 gallons an hour, so that's out of the question. This one can do 100 gallons an hour. I only need 50. So what dial do I adjust? There are two dials I can adjust. All right, well, as simple as dial is, let me slow it down. All right, that's your pulse. Well, what is pulse? When we get there, we go, okay, we count. We don't go 63, we go 63 what? 63 beats per minute. Well, here's time. So, all right. So cycles per unit time is, beats is a cycle. So cycles per unit time or beats per minute. In this case, we're doing it per minute. So let's see, I got time, I got time. Mathematically, that's good. I got beats. I don't have beats or cycles over here, so I got to get rid of it. So what am I going to do? I'm going to put beats over here. Because beats will cancel the beats. But what am I missing here? Volume. So if I do my algebra, I got volume per beat. So I got cycles per unit time times volume per cycle gives me volume per unit time. So beats cancel the beats, I got volumes per time. Well, this is pulse. So what's this? Volume per individual beat. We call that stroke volume. So let's take patient number 1, works out every day, does these marathon runs, everything else, well hydrated. You go to take their pulse and you find they have a pulse of 50 and they feel fine. You take the next guy that never works out, is 50 pounds overweight but feels fine, so their cardiac output's fine, standing here doing absolutely nothing. Make up a number, I think it's about 6 liters a minute. So for me to feel fine standing here, I got to put out 6 liters a minute. So the athlete does it. We'll say 5 because that'll make the math easier. Say I'm sitting down, 5 liters a minute. So 5,000 cc's per minute. I've got 50 beats per minute. That means my stroke volume is 100 cc's per beat. There's the athlete. What about the out of shape person? They're sitting there at 75 beats per minute. They got to put out the same 500 cc's per minute. So it's going to be somewhere around less than 70. 7 times 7 is 49. You throw in a 5, so we'll say 68. It gets us in the ballpark. Somewhere around 70, just below 70. So the athletic card is putting out 100 cc's every beat. So it's beating so well, strong, it's squeezing so well, it doesn't need to beat that often. The other person can't squeeze that well. Their heart is not in shape. They can't squeeze out so much blood, so they got to beat a lot more often to make up the difference. So when we start having problems, like this person has an altered mental status, or they get lightheaded when they stand up. Then we're saying, whoa, their cardiac output's inadequate. So what are we seeing? Well, I'm seeing the pulse running to 120, and they're getting lightheaded, so they're not achieving mission. So it must be their stroke volume is down. Why would their stroke volume be down? Why are they having this problem? Why are they getting lightheaded? Did they were out in the heat all day, they didn't drink, they're dehydrated, so their tank is empty, and they're trying to compensate by that by beating fast, but it's not achieving mission. Or they, in the case of us people, trauma, you bled, and now you've lost fluid in your tank, so you're trying to compensate by speeding up your beats to get your cardiac output, and you're not achieving mission, so you're lightheaded. Or maybe you are achieving mission, you feel okay, they have a normal mental status, but you recognize that they bled some, you stop the bleeding, but their pulse is 100. Okay, that's an indicator that they're trying to compensate for their low volume with a rapid pulse. All right, but are they getting worse? Do I need to replace the volume right at this point? In our case, in a Moscow situation, we're prioritizing, who gets treated first. This person they're feeling fine right now, they're not actively bleeding, their pulse is holding, it's 100, it's not at 150 or 120, they're not lightheaded, so I don't need to do anything more at the moment for this person. I'll get them blood later when we focus on this other person who has an altered mental status with a pulse of 120 and has bled. Or I think I stopped the bleeding, but now their pulse keeps rising. Well, maybe they're bleeding internally. So that's how I use pulse. And when you think about pulse, you've got two things. One is a normal pulse response to an abnormal situation. So you've got the heart doing the right thing in response to the low volume, whether that's dehydration, hemorrhagic shock, anaphylactic shock, whatever, but they're going into shock, and the heart is doing its normal response to an abnormal situation, elevating the pulse to get that cardiac output maintained. The other is a unique thing about the heart, all right? And that is, I'm going to take away some of this stuff because it's starting to look cluttered, but you got the concept there already, and that is, the heart is a muscle. Every muscle in the body, for it to contract, whether it's my bicep muscle lifting a weight, my heart beating, my intestine squeezing, the muscles there all require electrical input. In the case of my bicep muscle, that electrical impulse comes from the nerve, which shocks the muscle and makes it move. In the case of my heart, it's the only muscle in the body that every individual cell is capable of generating its own electricity. So what happens in the heart is, and it's a cardiac lecture with EKGs that I won't get into, but basically one of the cells in the heart, a group of cells, decides we're going to set the pace for the heart in response to this abnormal situation or normal situation, and we're going to decide how often the heart is going to beat. And we're going to tell the rest of the heart how quickly to beat. The heart is in charge of its situation, and it makes a normal response to either a normal situation, normal pulse rate, 60 to 90, or an abnormal situation. I'm in hemorrhagic shock, so I have to be faster. All right? So the other is the heart has some kind of short circuit, and you have no reason to beat fast, and the heart decides, because of the short circuit, it's going to beat fast anyway. And that's a whole EKG lecture for another day, but that's an abnormal heart response to a normal situation. So when you get tachycardia, you're going, is this a normal response to an abnormal situation? Do they have a reason to be tachycardic? If they have no reason to be tachycardic, why are they in short circuit mode? The alternative is they're bradycardic, so now they're going too slow, and you go, okay, well, is that a normal response to a normal situation? I got an athletic heart that can really pump out the blood, so their resting heart rate is in the 50s. All right? And that's one of my health clues in life. If you're older than your pulse, you're doing great. So I'm 56, so if my pulse is less than 56, that means I'm healthy. And mine tends to be. So thank you, Army, for making me work out. Or is the heart failing to respond? So I get that bradycardia, but the person has a normal mental status. That means their stroke volume is adequate, their cardiac output is adequate. I don't care if they have a bradycardia. It's normal for them. But I have somebody who has an altered mental status, lightheadedness, and has a bradycardia. I'm like, well, why isn't the heart responding to this lightheadedness? The brain is screaming at the heart saying, hey, look, I'm not getting what I need. You better do something. And so that's an abnormal heart response. And now is there something wrong with the heart that's causing it? And in the case of, you know, your BLS training, now you start going, okay, do I need to do CPR? And that's one of the criteria. You look at a little child, that's part of the BLS criteria. They have a pulse, but it's too slow. You're starting to beat for them and start your CPR. In the case of an adult, they got their bradycardia. Now we get into ACLS protocols and medications to try to drive that heart rate up or get a pacemaker in them. But I better be ready to do CPR, all right? Because they are symptomatically bradycardic, and that's not right. So the heart must be damaged and not able to respond and get that pulse rate up. So that's how I interpret the pulse rate. All right, so we know the pulse is one of the dials of the heart, the other is stroke volume. What I'm trying to measure is cardiac output. If I really wanted to truly know cardiac output, the way to do that is to stab somebody in the neck, put a wire through the needle, put a catheter over the wire, pull the wire out, put some fluid in the catheter, attach it to a computer monitor, squirt some fluid in there, usually some temperature control fluid, so at the heart we can then measure the temperature of the blood change as it beats through the heart, and then we can compute this calculation and tell us actually what the cardiac output is. Since we're not going to do that normally, because that's done in the ICU, we're not going to do that out in the street, we're not going to do that in a clinic, we're not going to do it in a trauma situation or anything else, we're just going to check a pulse, so we have to assume what the cardiac output is based on the mental status. And think, is there any other reason besides the heart that they might have an altered mental status, like blood sugar levels, whatever, but in terms of circulatory system, we're thinking, is their tank low, or is their tank expanded like anaphylactic shock where the blood vessels dilate, so you had enough blood to fill the tank, but now the tank's too big because all the blood vessels are dilated, so relatively speaking, the tank is empty, and you give epi to try to squeeze that tank back down, Benadryl to try to squeeze that tank back down, if needed, fluids to fill the tank, all right? So that's the things you're thinking about, all right, as you're going through this assessment. So that's the information you're trying to glean from pulse, all right? Hopefully this helps you. The biggest lesson learned here is mental status, mental status. The brain is the most sensitive organ to continuous oxygenation, fluid flow, nutrient flow, and if it doesn't get it, it tells you instantaneously. So use that information to figure out what's wrong. All right? Hope to see you in the next video, and hopefully I get these all uploaded and you hit that subscribe button. All right? And then I get all the YouTube hits, and then I become rich and millionaire. All right? Thank you very much. All right, this is a continuation just to make it a little easier from yesterday's lecture on the pulse. All right, so I'll add this to the end of the lecture from yesterday. These are the key teaching points from that. So what is the system? What system is the pulse a part of? All right, the second question actually answers that for you. So remember, through the things, what you would have picked up is a circulatory system. What are the parts of the circulatory system? All right, the answer there, the key teaching point pearls was the heart, the pump, the vessels, the container, and the blood, the fluid. The three parts of any circulatory system, whether it's your pool or your heart, whatever. What are the most sensitive organs to continuous perfusion? That's the biggest question and answer, and that's the brain. How long does it take the brain to figure out instantaneously that there's a problem? All right, and then what are the two valves of the heart? And they are the pulse, and I'm also writing it in black because yesterday the red wasn't quite easy to see, which is beats per minute, or rate for any pump. The second is the stroke volume, and that is volume per beat. And those are the two tiles, the two things that the heart can adjust. You can either squeeze harder and put out more per squeeze, or it can squeeze more often, or do both. All right, and the combination gives us your output. In the case of the heart, that's the cardiac output, which is volume per unit time. In this case, we measure it in minutes. All right, since we take pulse in minutes, stroke volume in minutes. All right, and the only way to figure out cardiac output truly is in the ICU with big needles into the necks and wires and tubes and stuff like that. So what we're doing in clinic is we are looking at the pulse, the beats per minute, and then assuming the cardiac output based on the brain, and then trying to determine if there's an issue with volume or the pulse, and that goes back to earlier in the lecture. So I just want to review those quick points. All right, that's what you should have picked up from the last 20-30 minutes of this presentation. All right, see you in the next video.